Okay guys, today we are going to talk about characters, which I know you're very familiar with at this point, and characterization. So I'm going to go ahead and title my notes, Characters, and Characterization. The EQ for this one is the following. How do authors reveal what the characters in a story are like? Okay, and now I'm going to go ahead and make my columns. I've got my question column where I'm going to put any vocabulary terms or study questions later. And I've got my notes column. So first off, let's look at what the definition of character is. So a character is any individual in a story. So an individual in a story. So it doesn't matter what kind of story it is. It could be a movie, it could be a video game, it could be a novel or graphic novel, etc. Any made up individual in whatever kind of story you're looking at, we call those characters. And I'm just going to put one example that we all know, Goldilocks, right? She is an example of a character. But you can think of the characters in your favorite shows. A lot of you guys like SpongeBob. SpongeBob's a character. If you like Mario from the Nintendo games, Mario's a character, etc. So characters are kind of really important to a story, right? They're the ones that make the stuff in the story happen. They're the actors in the story. So characters are responsible for making the plot events of a story happen. Without characters, there's nothing happening in the story, right? So, a couple ways that characters make things happen. They can initiate an event. So that means they can start an event, right? They can also react to an event. Just like you react to things that happen to you, well-written characters react to the things that happen to them or around them in a story. And another way that they can influence events is the interactions that occur between characters. If you don't know what my shorthand stands for, BT stands for between, you guys are allowed to develop your own shorthand for taking notes as well. So you could either write out this word between, or you could just use my abbreviation for it. So interactions between characters can move the plot along, or sometimes the interactions are the plot, right? If two characters are having a big argument, that's probably part of the plot. Okay, so you guys are probably very familiar with this term, main character. The main character is the character that the story mostly focuses on. So if you're reading the Harry Potter books, obviously, since the books are named after him, Harry Potter is the main character. He is the character that the story is mostly focused on. These words right here that I'm about to introduce to you may be new. The first one is protagonist. And I know I used this word the other day when I was talking to you guys about Brian from Hatchet being the protagonist. So the protagonist is the character who's working on solving the conflict of the story. So he's working on solving the problem. Character who's working to solve the conflict, aka problem, of the story. So most of the time, the main character and the protagonist are the same character. So most of the time. But there are some exceptions to that. So don't always assume that the main character and the protagonist are the same character. An example of this, I know a lot of you guys, probably almost all of you guys, have not read the novel To Kill a Mockingbird. But in that story, the main character is a little girl named Scout. And it basically follows Scout's adventures throughout the novel. However, one of the main problems in the novel To Kill a Mockingbird is a man who has been charged unfairly with a crime. And Scout's father, Atticus Finch, is actually the character who is working to solve that problem. So in that novel To Kill a Mockingbird, Scout's the main character, but her father, Atticus Finch, is viewed as the protagonist because he's the one who's actually working to solve the problem. But, like I said, most of the time, almost all of the time, the main character and the protagonist are the same character. So Harry Potter is the protagonist in the Harry Potter books. Another new vocabulary term for you guys, you might not have experience with yet, is antagonist. So it's got that word root here. We've been talking about word roots. Ant is a form of anti. And if you know what anti means, it means to go against something. So the antagonist is the character that goes against the protagonist. Okay, so in the Harry Potter books, Harry Potter's the protagonist, and the antagonist, the person that he's going against, that's Voldemort, right? Or he who must not be named. Going to my video game roots, if I'm thinking about a protagonist from video games, I could have Mario as a protagonist, or Sonic, right? And then my antagonist is the person who's going against them. So in the Mario games, Mario's antagonist is always Bowser. And then in the old school Sonic games, Sonic's antagonist is Dr. Robotnik, right? So you've got the protagonist. Most of the time we can view them as the hero, and the antagonist, most of the time we can view them as the bad guy. Okay, so most of the time, good authors don't tell you directly about their characters. So good authors usually don't tell you what their characters are like. Don't usually tell you. Okay, so if they don't tell us what their characters are like, how do we figure it out? Well, usually we have to make inferences about what the characters are like as a person, and we have to also make inferences about what the character's point of view or perspective is on things. So I'm not talking about narrative point of view here. I'm talking about, when I'm talking about character point of view, I'm talking about the character's opinion. Okay? So good authors don't usually tell us directly about their characters. Usually you have to make inferences based on what they show us to determine what they're like as a person and what their POV / opinions on things are. Okay, so usually the text where the author is just like listing everything about a character, those are going to be the ones that make you fall asleep. The ones where you have to use your brain a little bit to figure out what the character is like, those are going to be the books that you enjoy reading. And we should keep that in mind for when we have to write a narrative later on. Just giving me a list of adjectives describing your character, that is boring. But making me think a little bit based on the actions that you show me about your character, that is a much more interesting way to read. So we know that the author is not going to directly give us information, so that means we're going to have to look somewhere else for it or use the text to figure out exactly what we're looking for. So another word we need to know the meaning of is characterization. And this is how the author develops the character. So how they make them seem like a real person, okay? So characterization develops the character, makes the character seem real. So characterization is all the stuff that the author uses to make the character seem real. And we're going to use Steele to help us go through the different ways that an author can do this characterization thing. So how they make them feel real. To make these inferences, we can actually use another acronym to help us remember the different ways to analyze a character. And that acronym is called STEEL. Okay, so we are going to use Vashti from the dot to help us practice this skill right now to make inferences about what she's like as a person. So the first part of STEEL is the S, and the S stands for speech. What's the character say? How do they say it? So think about this in real life. You can get a pretty good idea of what a person is like based on how they talk to other people, right? And what words they choose or how they talk about other people. You can do the same thing with characters. So for Vashti, I've got this piece of evidence from the text. If I can make little dots, I can make big dots too. So what's the inference that I can make from that? So remember, when we make an inference, we're making a guess based on text clues, so the example I've got here, and my life experience. So if I were to hear a student saying something like this, if I can make little dots, I could make big dots too, I would infer that that student likes experimenting. So I'm going to write my inference here. Vashti enjoys experimenting. All right, so that was easy enough. I looked at her speech. I made an inference about what she's like as a person based on that piece of speech. Now, I'm going to go ahead and look at the T in STEEL. The T stands for thoughts. So something to keep in mind is not every type of POV, narrative POV we have, is going to let us see what characters are thinking. So really, whether or not you can make an inference about a character using thoughts, that's going to depend on the point of view that the story is being told from. Okay, so what does the character think? And here is our example from the dot. Vashti has the thought, well, maybe I can't draw. But I can sign my name. Okay, so now I need to make my inference about what that reveals to me about her. So the fact that she's kind of prejudging herself here when she says, I can't draw. But she does recognize that she can do this other thing. So I'm going to say here that I'm going to make the inference that Vashti thinks she knows what she's capable of. We find out later in the story that she's much more capable than she realized, but she had to develop that growth mindset, right? So we've got speech, we've got thoughts. Now we're going to move on to effect on others. Okay, so you guys know that when you move through the world, that you affect the people around you, and you can affect their judgments of you, you can affect how happy they are, their moods throughout the day. Well-written characters have the same effect, or effects rather, on the characters around them. So how do other characters treat them? React to them. Here's from the dot. We have the character say, you're a really great artist. So remember, this is that little boy at the end of the story after he's been to Vashti's art show. You're a really great artist. I wish I could draw. All right, so from that piece of evidence, from that piece of dialogue, from the story, it's very easy to see that Vashti inspires others, right? Her growth mindset and her drive to go out there and create new types of dots, people have watched that and they've become inspired by it. They want to go and be artists too. So Vashti had a positive effect on the people around her. Next, we have actions. So sometimes people say one thing or think one thing and then their actions don't match up. We have to watch to see if their actions match with what they say and do. So what do they do? All right, so in the dot, we've got the quote, Vashti kept experimenting. Now that looks like it's lining up with the other stuff that I've seen her do and the things that I've seen her think. She's showing me that growth mindset, right? She's developing that. And I can also make the inference that when she gets excited by something, she just runs with it. She gets carried away with it and she keeps working at it. So when Vashti gets excited by something, she runs with it. Okay, so I made an inference about what she's like when she's excited about something based on that quote. She kept experimenting, so she just keeps going with it, right? And our last part of steal is looks. So sometimes our author tries to get us to make inferences about what the character is like based on how they look. So what do they look like? So we don't have any quotes from the dot to show what Vashti looks like, but Peter H. Reynolds, the author and illustrator of the story, did give us a picture of the dot, right? So that would be our example here. We can use those pictures to help come up with an idea or an inference about Vashti. Okay, so this one's a little bit harder, right? Because we have to kind of look at those pictures and analyze how she looks a little bit. So pictures from the story, the inference that I'm going to make from there is that she's just a little girl, right? She's a kid. All right, so all of the stuff that I just went through with you, that's all called characterization. And that's basically how the author develops their character. It's how they make their character feel like a real person. So we look at their speech, we look at their thoughts, the effect that they have on others, their actions, and their looks. Okay, so now that we've taken these notes, remember you need to go back in the questions column and you're going to copy down any vocabulary words like characterization, and you're going to create study questions to help you practice the material, right? So I could just write the word characterization in here. And that's my reminder that I need to know that word, that it's important for this class, and that I need to know what it means. And then when you're working on your summary, you're going to attempt to answer the essential question. So answer EQ. And our EQ for this one was, how do authors reveal what the characters in a story are like? And so I'm probably going to be talking about steal in my summary, right? I'll talk about the different types of characters. So main character, protagonist, antagonist, and then I'll go through and I'll talk about how we can use a character's speech, thoughts, the effect they have on others, their actions, and their looks, and how all of those things can be used to make an inference about what the character is like as a person. So that would be what I put in my summary.